Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. And we begin with that very fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran amid a new wave of Israeli attacks in the region that have infuriated Iranian officials who are responding by reasserting Tehran's control over the Strait of Hormuz. This morning, Israel unleashed another wave of attacks in Beirut as part of its ongoing offensive against the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. It follows a series of bombardments yesterday, which, according to Lebanese officials, killed more than 250 people, including nearly 100 in Beirut. Now, Iran claims that Israel's actions are a clear violation of its ceasefire agreement with the U.S., but the Trump administration is insisting that Lebanon was not part of any deal.
I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states.
Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire. That has been relayed to all parties involved in the ceasefire. This will continue to be discussed, I am sure, between the President and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the United States and Israel, and all of the parties involved. But at this point in time, they're not included in the ceasefire deal.
However, it seems the administration is clearly concerned about those strikes in Lebanon. According to a senior administration official, during a phone call yesterday, President Trump personally asked Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to scale back Israel's strikes on Lebanon to help ensure the success of the upcoming negotiations with Iran. And the president telling our colleague Peter Nicholas in a phone call this morning that Israel will be scaling back its attacks and saying, quote, I spoke with Netanyahu, and he's going to low-key it. I just think we sort of have to be a little more low-key, the words of the president. Prime Minister Netanyahu now says Israel is seeking direct negotiations with Lebanon as soon as possible. President Trump also telling NBC News he remains very optimistic that a deal with Iran is in reach and that Iran is agreeing to all the things they have said to agree to. Remember, they've been conquered and they have no military. That's the impression, the assessment of President Trump. Now, despite those claims from President Trump, Iran continues to exert its authority over the Strait of Hormuz. The White House says Iran has agreed to reopen the vital waterway. But after Israel strikes, Iran says it remains closed and marine traffic right now remains at a virtual standstill. That is also according to analysts at S&P. Only 5 vessels were able to pass through the strait today. Normally, that number is well above 100. Today's Iran state media read a new statement they say is from the supreme leader, in which he says Iran will enter a new phase in the management of the strait, and that Iran is praying for a decisive victory, whether it be through negotiations or on the battlefield. Now, of course, it's important to note that we have not actually seen or heard from the new supreme leader himself since the war began, when he was reportedly injured in that first major salvo of strikes. So joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Garrett Haake. Our chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons, is in Saudi Arabia, and also NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. All of you here to help us understand all of this. Garrett, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that the president is saying that Netanyahu needs to scale back and that he has sent that message?
Yeah, I think it tells us a lot about where Iran's red lines are in this negotiation. The idea, as the vice president suggested, that Lebanon was left out of the initial ceasefire was in contrast with everything that the Iranians were saying. And to your point about what we know about ship traffic, the strait wasn't opening up. The Iranians felt like Lebanon needed to be the part of the deal. And I think that may be why we saw the president reach out to Netanyahu and say something has to be done on this point to get what the U.S. thinks it's getting out of a ceasefire deal. And so I think, it should probably be looked at as a positive development for any number of reasons, but it suggests that the president is willing to throw his political weight around here to get to an agreement that ultimately is acceptable to both sides.
Do we have a sense of how the president is assessing the degree of traffic moving through the Strait of Hormuz? He said it has to be opened, and yet the data says it is still a constrained space. Do we get any sense that the president has a level of tolerance for where it stands right now?
Well, he's posted about this a couple of times, saying that the strait has to be open, that's his expectation. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, took a couple of questions on this point yesterday that, in the White House's view, free transit of the strait means free transit, that a toll or some kind of metered system by the Iranians would not be acceptable. But I haven't detected any significant amount of haste around this or of impatience from the White House yet. I think there's an understanding, you heard some of this from J.D. Vance, that even the communication of the details of this ceasefire might take some time within Iran, and it might take some time for things to settle down after some 40 days of war. So I don't get the sense that anyone is particularly panicked about, the lack of movement thus far before these talks now scheduled for Saturday start in earnest.
You get the sense the president is not quite so patient when it comes to his relationship with NATO. He has been so critical publicly, and he also had an opportunity to meet with the Secretary General and to convey his thoughts on that. What do we know about how that meeting went? What are the signs of how frank and candid it really was?
Yeah, to use the Washington euphemism for a very challenging meeting. I think that's appropriate, Kelly, because we've not seen these two men appear on camera, which is very unusual for two men who do have, by all accounts, a very good personal relationship. And we've heard from Mark Rutte at a couple of interviews here domestically in which he's mostly dodged questions about what exactly the president told him about his patience level with NATO and what steps he might take to either punish it or bring it up to speed. I mean, you mentioned a lack of patience with NATO. I would say, given the vociferousness with which the president complained about NATO going back to his first term, in some ways he has been patient in the sense that he's been banging on NATO for going on 10 years now, and the U.S. is still a member. But I think we're probably going to see more from Rutte and more from the president about specific steps to bring the alliance along in these conversations about what happens next in Iran, or else we're going to see a lot more frustration and perhaps some action from the president, because it's pretty clear he wasn't satisfied with what he heard from Rutte the other day.
I take your point on it being a long-term punching bag for sure. Let me turn now to Keir. Let's talk about Israel and Lebanon. And where do you think things stand right now with movement toward negotiations that could bring some of the hostility, some of the tension, and the unpredictable nature of things, perhaps calming that down?
Well, I think the Israeli government, let's put it this way, is highly skeptical of the potential for negotiations to achieve what it wants to achieve. It has been targeting Hezbollah through this war, and then it launched that massive onslaught on Beirut in the past 24 to 48 hours. And that, the Israeli government says, was targeting Hezbollah. It's killed, according to the Lebanese health ministry, 300 plus people. And for Lebanese, it has been an incredibly traumatic period right at the end of all of this, right when the ceasefire was being announced. And the Israelis say there is no ceasefire in Lebanon, even though they are prepared to talk. So I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing what he feels he needs to keep the Trump administration on board, and probably no more than that, because the Israelis clearly continue to assess a threat from Hezbollah that they want to confront.
Of course, you are coming to us from Saudi Arabia, and you get a sense that some of the partner nations in that part of the world are looking at the situation with fragile ceasefire in one place, still hostilities between Israel and Lebanon in another, and how that impacts all of them. What is your take today?
Yeah, I will tell you, Kelly, it's been quiet here today. We saw a fighter jet we couldn't quite identify overhead some hours ago. But this is a place where we are now in Saudi Arabia that has been bombarded. Bahrain is just across the water behind me again, has been bombarded through the war. But there have been pretty much no attacks through this recent hours. That Kuwait says that there was something. That there's clearly a scaling down of the attacks by Iran, and you have to say that that is I think a good indicator that they are serious about these talks, but they are also serious about gaining from the talks. And the statement that we heard from Iran's new supreme leader, that I think indicates just how hard line Iran is going to be as it gets into these talks. Things like expecting sanctions to be lifted, still wanting control of the Strait of Hormuz. These are going to be very, very difficult days.
The Strait, of course, is a key lever for Iran, and there was some discussion from the foreign minister there about planting mines in the Strait. Are you getting a sense that there has been any movement on that? That, of course, is a very volatile step for them to take if that has, in fact, happened.
Yeah, if it has happened. The difficulty is, and this is part of why the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil passes normally, that is part of why it's turned out to be such a potent weapon for Iran, because effectively all the Iranians need to do is to say that there's a threat, and that then becomes a threat that shipping companies are going to be worried about. And we haven't seen a huge uptick in the number of ships passing through the Strait because they are very cautious. In terms of insurance and in terms of their people on these ships, they are large, lumbering pieces of metal, easily targeted. So certainly, I think that question of mines, the question of the remaining missile capability, drone capability that the Iranians possess, they will be seeing that in Tehran as their leverage, and they're going to be going into these talks with that kind of weapon, if you like, still pointing at this region. And there is deep, deep unhappiness in this region about the way that the Gulf countries have been targeted. I mean, much of their geopolitical approach has been thrown up in the air by all of this. And that's something that's going to take time to resolve, no matter what the outcome of the talks are.
And you gave us sort of that reality check about how the business world also has a vote in this. So that takes me now to Brian. And markets, again, closing in the green today. And as we're trying to understand how Wall Street is responding to this, what do you think caused green to be so prominent today, given the events that are actually unfolding?
Yeah, well, look, I think that this fragile ceasefire does still remain fragile, but markets actually opened the day in the red, and it seemed like the bounce back that you see on that screen ahead of you, which took place around the later part of the morning, really had to do with some of the commentary that we've been hearing out of the Middle East, that Israel was opening up conversations with Lebanon, and for that reason, it does seem like markets are more optimistic that the trend, at least as of the last few headlines over the past, let's say, 24 hours, does point to this ceasefire holding than it does to the opposite. Now, I should point out that we're not out of the woods yet. And in fact, I've seen notes from investors in my inbox today that said I would not say that we are making any notable changes in our portfolio. That coming from one portfolio manager that actually has to decide where in this market do they place money. So the overall story today isn't really different than it was prior to the announcement of the ceasefire, which is that the volatility in these markets, Kelly, those big up days, big down days, remains the story, because no one can predict how this ends until there is a more permanent resolution to all of this. It seems like that rocky road will remain the theme on Wall Street.
And another key factor we've all been watching, oil prices. Today they jumped compared to yesterday. Oil markets appearing overly optimistic yesterday about the ceasefire, perhaps. What is your sense of what oil is telling us about conditions?
Yeah, and crude oil barrels settling at around $98 does suggest that there's a bit of a change in the oil market thinking on this ceasefire when you consider that it was a little bit closer to $92, $93 yesterday. But we do still need to point out that those crude oil prices were really flirting with $120 in the lead up to the ceasefire. So it's still down dramatically. But again, another point of comparison that I should point people to is that we're still well above where we were pre-war, when crude oil barrels were trading somewhere between $60 and $70. So even when you take a look at the recent price action, you have to zoom out to realize oil prices are not going to go back to those pre-war levels. Analysts that I've spoken to in the last few days have said you should not expect to see that anytime soon, in part not only because we aren't seeing the massive flow of tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, as you were just talking about with Kier, but also because of the fact that even if those floodgates open on ships actually moving through there have been so much damage to those oil-producing facilities in that region that it's going to take years in some cases to rebuild the capacity of oil coming out of that area. And for that reason, that could lead to elevated oil costs in the medium term. So even if the ceasefire holds, there is reason to think that the damage has already been done to the global economy.
And the price people pay in their budgets and at the pump, that'll continue to be a pain point. Thank you, Brian. We appreciate your time. And coming up, a top advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu joins us on this tenuous state of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire and President Trump's demands that Israel pull back on its attacks on Lebanon. Plus, the view from inside Beirut. We'll hear directly from a world central kitchen chef working to keep civilians fed as violence and a mounting humanitarian emergency grip that region. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. New comments from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this afternoon, telling Israelis there is no ceasefire with Lebanon, and Israel is continuing to strike Hezbollah targets, quote, with force. Now, that's despite earlier today saying he was open to direct talks with Lebanon's government. Sources tell NBC News that direct negotiations between Israel and Lebanon are under discussion to take place as early as next week. Netanyahu's vow to keep striking Hezbollah seems to go against President Trump telling our colleague Peter Nicholas at a phone call today that Israel was going to scale back its attacks in Lebanon, saying, quote, I spoke with Bibi and he's going to low-key it. I just think we have to be sort of a little more low-key. Those are the words of the president. Joining me now is Ophir Falk, the chief foreign policy advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We're so pleased to have you with us today. Thank you for making time.
Thank you for having me, Kelly.
Thank you. Appreciate it. President Trump is trying to send a message that he believes Israel will scale back, that he has delivered that message to the prime minister. But we're also understanding that Mr. Netanyahu says there are targets in Hezbollah related to Hezbollah in Beirut that he wants to strike. So where does it stand right now? Is there a scaling back, or is there ongoing forceful attacks inside Beirut?
Well, there was no real need to ask to scale back, because the hit yesterday was the hardest hit that we hit Hezbollah since the pager operation, where we took out hundreds of Hezbollah terrorists. We took out hundreds of Hezbollah terrorists yesterday, and clearly we're going to be hitting different places. And as the Prime Minister said, there is no ceasefire with Hezbollah. We have to degrade their capabilities. And if there's one thing that we've learned from the October 7th atrocity, is that we cannot have a genocidal terrorist organization on our border. We can't have Hamas on our border in the south, in Gaza, and we can't have Hezbollah on our border in the north, in Lebanon.
So when we hear the president using the phrase, we need to low-key it a little bit, we need to scale back, that's not happening.
Well, the Prime Minister and the President have had the greatest cooperation. They have the greatest cooperation and coordination throughout the war. At the greatest cooperation I've ever seen between a President and a Prime Minister, and between our armed forces, between the American and Israeli armed forces. We're partners in war, and we're also partners in peace.
But on this point, apparently there is a disagreement. If they see it so differently, scaling back and going forward are not the same thing.
Actually, we are in complete agreement between the Prime Minister and the President.
Let me move on to a different point. The World Health Organization says the evacuation order for Beirut includes 2 major hospitals, and there are no alternative medical facilities available to receive the 450 patients from those hospitals. And they're calling on Israel to reverse that order. Will Israel comply in that way?
Well, Israel will take that into consideration. Israel does everything possible to mitigate, to minimize the harm to civilians. We always do. At the same time, Hezbollah and the Iranian regime and Hamas does everything possible to put civilians in harm's way. They use civilians as human shields. That's what they do on all the fronts, and we do everything possible to minimize the harm to civilians. And we'll continue to do that. But the terrorists, the Hezbollah terrorists, will not have immunity. They can hide or they can run, but they can't hide. And we'll get them. We've taken out over 1,000 Hezbollah terrorists since they launched the war against us, and we'll continue to do what is needed to secure the Israeli citizens.
Is there a sense that having conversations, trying to get to some sort of agreement with Lebanon and to deal with Hezbollah at the negotiating table. Do you believe that's actually going to happen? How realistic is that?
Well, our goal in the negotiations with Lebanon is to dismantle Hezbollah and to reach a peace agreement with Lebanon. That is the exact same. That's a mutual interest for the Lebanese people and the Lebanese government, is to forge peace with Israel and to dismantle Hezbollah, which has taken the Lebanese people hostage for years. In this operation, we've been able to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities significantly, and we're going to continue to degrade their capabilities. And that is what has enabled the negotiations between the Lebanese government and Israel to continue degrading and to dismantle Hezbollah and to forge a historic peace, possibly an historic peace between Lebanon and Israel, peace through strength.
We understand the Lebanese government has expressed a powerlessness to control Hezbollah. Do you accept that? And do you think that is an impediment to trying to get anything done through negotiations?
Sorry, can you repeat that question, Kelly? I had a problem.
Sure, no problem. The Lebanese government has talked about its inability to stop Hezbollah, to control Hezbollah. Do you think that's a serious impediment to having any kinds of negotiations?
Well, clearly, we had a ceasefire agreement in November 24. That was a clear agreement that the Lebanese government needed to dismantle Hezbollah and demilitarize southern Lebanon. That did not happen. That did not happen. Either it's because of a lack of will or a lack of capability, but it did not happen. And that's what forced our hand now to go back into Lebanon again after we were attacked. And that's what we're doing right now. We're degrading Hezbollah and we're demilitarizing southern Lebanon. And we're not going to let this genocidal terrorist organization anywhere near our border. Now that Hezbollah has been degraded significantly, Lebanon, or maybe the Lebanon government, can step up to the plate and to do the right thing and to continue to degrade and to dismantle Hezbollah. And that's what we're going to be talking about, amongst other things. That's what we're going to be talking about in the negotiations.
There'll be another set of negotiations coming up in Pakistan where the U.S. will be dealing with Iran. Israel is not a party to those negotiations. What does Israel want to see come out of that?
Well, our objectives in Operation Roaring Lion were to remove the existential threat posed by the Ayatollah regime, including their nuclear capabilities, their ballistic missile capabilities, and to create the conditions for the Iranian people to do the right thing and to take their destiny into their own hands. What have we achieved so far in this war? We've degraded their nuclear capabilities significantly, including by taking out an additional key nuclear bomb scientists. We've taken out thousands of missiles. We've degraded their capability of producing additional missiles. We've taken out hundreds of launchers. In terms of the regime, we've taken out their key leadership.
Do you consider that regime change, though, sir?
Leadership.
Removing personnel, do you think it's regime change?
Part of it is to remove the Ayatollah regime. That is part of it. And to create the conditions, that's part of creating the conditions for the Iranian people to take their destiny in their own hands. Sooner or later, this regime will fall. It will fall.
We so appreciate your time and your insights today. Thank you for opening your schedule for us today. Ophir Falk, thank you so much for your time. And groups in Lebanon. Thank you, sir. Groups in Lebanon say more than 1 million people have been displaced in the last 5 weeks as violence has intensified across the country, creating a dire humanitarian situation. Families have been arriving to shelters with very little, many struggling to feed themselves. Chef Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen has been working around the clock to help feed some of these families. I spoke last hour with the chef leading those operations, Aline Kamakian, and I began by asking her to describe what the last few days have been like in Beirut, where she has been working. Let's watch.
Yesterday was, everybody was waiting a ceasefire, but instead we had an unexpected, huge bombing everywhere. 100 targets in 10 minutes, they said, but it was a nightmare for us. almost simultaneously, different neighborhoods in Beirut were hit by very heavy bomb, loud explosions. Everywhere, smoke rose up from all sides, blood everywhere. You know, it was like the several strikes were in the busy commercial areas, densely populated areas. It reminds me of the port explosion, where the dust was that shocked you, the smell of the blood, the sound of the sirens, everything is very heavy. You know, people is desperate, and people are every place where people and injured people, and all the cars were transformed to ambulance. And Ministry of Health was telling, please get out of the street so that we can take the wounded people into hospitals. Hospitals are overcrowded, and they have materials and medicine and needles and everything that is missing because of the heavy injured people that is coming every day and every day. Within a month, we have more than 1.2 million people displaced before yesterday.
And the chaos that you're describing is hard to even comprehend, and the unpredictability of it all. I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about wanting to have talks with Lebanon. And what do you think the leaders need to hear from someone like you, who is seeing what the real human effect is and the needs are as they head into the potential for some kind of talks?
You know, the need is extremely high. People are living in shelters, which is not ready to be a shelter. It's a school, basically. It's a governmental school. There's no basic needs. There's no toilet. There's no shower. Women and children are condensed in this shelter. It's overcrowded. And anytime epidemic can rise because of the no hygiene whatsoever. We're not ready we don't have shelters. We don't have real protected shelters, well equipped and everything. The need is extremely high. World Central Kitchen is cooking and distributing hot meals, and we're really, we're growing, and we're cooking a lot every day, more and more. But the need
I understand
is
you're
so
up to more than 1 million meals so far that you and the team have been able to provide, which is obviously just an enormous number and speaks to the depth of the need. And do you get a sense that there is a next step in the work that you're doing for your team? Is your area, is that expanding?
Just while we're talking, we have a new evacuation order right now, bigger than almost half of Beirut should be evacuated. I don't know where we will go. Where should we go? The need is extremely high. Despite the ongoing security challenges, the World Central Kitchen continues to adapt operation. We relocate the kitchen. We're adapting to the situation. We're partnering with local chefs and volunteers. We're coordinating closely with the municipality and government to be able to cook and to distribute. The million is a bittersweet feeling, you know, like we're very proud that we've done this figure, but from the other part, we're heartbroken because we know how many people are still in need. We need today, you know, it's not tomorrow, it's not after 1 month. People are hungry. The need is extremely high, and today you have almost 17% of the population is in acute food insecurity. This means like you have around 900,000 people do not have a secure access to basic food. The number is rising. Lebanon is almost import 80% of its food, especially wheat. We have vegetables and fruits, but the rest is all imported, so extremely expensive. A lot of people will not afford food.
Well, what you are describing certainly gives us a picture of the urgency and the health concerns that can result from the kind of displacement that you're talking about. Thank you for giving us a window into the crisis there. Chef Aline, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you well. And still to come, an unprecedented moment today at the White House. First Lady Melania Trump delivering a rare on-camera statement denying that she has any ties to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, while also calling for Congress to hold public hearings with survivors. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to breaking news from the White House, and it's not the type you might normally expect. This is very unexpected. Remarks today from First Lady Melania Trump, where she came out to talk about Jeffrey Epstein, railing against what she called lies tying her to the late convicted sex offender.
The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today. I am not Epstein's victim. Epstein did not introduce me to Donald Trump. I have never had any knowledge of Epstein's abuse of his victims. I was never involved in any capacity. I was not a participant.
Really extraordinary comments coming from Mrs. Trump. And of course, this follows Congress's actions where they forced the release of files on the investigation into Epstein. And Congress continues to investigate Epstein's relationship with a number of prominent figures. Now, today, the First Lady urging Congress to go further and to allow Epstein's survivors to publicly testify.
I call on Congress to provide the women who have been victimized by Epstein with a public hearing specifically centered around the survivors. Give these victims their opportunity to testify under oath in front of Congress with the power of sworn testimony. Each and every woman should have her day to tell her story in public if she wishes.
Joining me now from the White House is Monica Alba. Also with us is National Law Enforcement and Intelligence Correspondent Tom Winter. And Monica, we are very conditioned to expect the unexpected from the White House, but not from the East Wing, meaning the First Lady's office. This is really extraordinary for her to speak about the victims, to distance herself. How much was this under wraps before Mrs. Trump actually delivered her remarks? How much of a shockwave was felt at the White House?
This was an extremely tightly held speech, Kelly. I can tell you that they made the announcement that she was going to be making some kind of statement about a day ago, and there had been a lot of speculation about what that could be on. She had chosen a very similar venue some months back to talk about her work toward trying to reunify children of Ukraine with their families after the Russian invasion. So there were questions about whether this could be something similar to that. But the fact that she came out today and addressed head on for the very first time some of these very persistent questions about what she may have known about Jeffrey Epstein, her potential relationship with him, which she really has denied here, is extremely significant for a First Lady that is so cautious and so calculated about when she decides to make her moves, about what she decides to say in public, and about what she wants people to know about her. I've been covering her for years, and she is intensely private and, again, very intentional. But we do know from our reporting that over the last year or so, she has privately been very upset and very angry about what her team calls these defamatory rumors, this falsehoods, these information, specifically, again, linking her to Epstein, that we know that that is something she talked about, again, behind closed doors, but she had never made the leap to want to come and talk about it in public until today. And that is why what we saw today was so extraordinary, as you called it.
And what we're accustomed to hearing from the president, he has used the phrase, it's a Democrat hoax, meaning the attention around it, or that it's a distraction, or everyone should move on. Do you have any sense about why now for Melania Trump?
Yeah, and what's also really interesting here is that the president has tried to call it a, quote, dead issue, has really tried to put it in the rear view, especially when we do talk about the role Congress is playing. But that seems to be a part of potentially the answer to the question of why now, because this isn't just a statement to clear the air, so to speak. This is a statement that also has a call to action. This is the First Lady of the United States asking lawmakers, asking Congress to do something that they haven't done yet, which is to have these survivors come together in an open hearing to provide that testimony under oath and to have their stories heard, she says, because in her words, then only then will the truth be known. So it seems like there is sort of a collision here, potentially, Kelly, of where Congress has been heading, trying to seek more information on this, and with the First Lady, or the potential for some additional story or reporting that might be coming, additional information that could always come out, that certainly did come out when we did see the release of those additional emails. And that's another fact of this, Kelly, the fact that there was some email correspondence between Melania Trump and between Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator, many, many years ago. She wanted to come out, she says, and talk about this as, quote, casual correspondence, and said that it was really nothing beyond that. But that was new information that we got from the First Lady in terms of those private communications many, many years ago that had only come out as a result of that push in Congress for additional information. Kelly.
Let me bring Tom into our conversation now. And for our viewers to understand, Tom has been working the Epstein case for years, has read extensively the voluminous files, the most recent ones, but also the court documents and so forth earlier. So he's got a lot of background on this. Can you give us a sense of what Melania Trump was referring to when she was touting these lies that she wanted to distance herself from? What's that about?
Yeah, Kelly, I think the biggest one that she probably wanted to address, and we heard from her there, that she specifically addresses the idea that Jeffrey Epstein introduced her to Donald Trump, and that's how their relationship began. This comes up in what's called an FBI 302, and we're going to show it for you. In the course of an interview, there's a section there, you can read it in the second paragraph, just below that heavily redacted section that says, Epstein introduced Melania Trump to Donald Trump. An FBI 302, the 302 just is the name of the document, are the notes from the agents conducting an interview. We don't know specifically who they're speaking to here. It's a former assistant of Jeffrey Epstein's that they're talking to. We don't know that person's name. And they're just notes of an interview. So we don't know in what context that information is offered. We don't know if it was offered for the truth or it was just, hey, here's something I heard. It was a rumor. It was a discussion. These statements that are included within the FBI 302, they are never offered in a court proceeding. They are not offered for the truth, as they say in court. It is not admissible. They're basically just the notes of the FBI agent. They happen to be typed up because that's the way we all do things now. We memorialize them in some sort of an electronic form. But typically they come off of the handwritten documents that FBI agents take when they're talking to somebody, and they very rarely record their interviews. So this could just have been somebody offering this as a rumor that they heard this at some point. Some people have said, look, she's speaking to an FBI agent, this assistant. If, in fact, she lied to them, she could be charged. Well, that is true. But because that statement does have any sort of context around it, we don't know, Kelly, whether or not this is a rumor that they heard or something that they heard based more on fact. There is no other corroborating information that we've ever heard that ties Melania to Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump as far as getting their relationship started from anybody that's known them at any point.
And so when people think about the 3 million plus documents that have been released as a result of Congress passing a law that the president signed, any mention of Melania Trump in any of those documents?
Yes, for sure. So besides the reference that we just were chatting about, the other references, there's a number of communications that occur. We can show one of them for you now. It's a very simple email. It comes from Melania Trump to Ghislaine Maxwell. You're looking at there. Dear G, how are you? Nice story about J.E. and New York Mad, presumably Jeffrey Epstein. You look great on the picture. I know you're busy. Call me when you come back to New York. I think that speaks very specifically to some of the things that Melania Trump addressed, the First Lady addressed from the White House today in that extraordinary speech that Monica was there for. The idea that, look, I know these people. They were part of the circuit. To her point, she has always steadfastly said that she did not know of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes at the time. And obviously, as somebody who's speaking out now and saying that the victim should be heard, just as a kind of adjacent to that, in the course of our reporting, nobody has suggested to us that there was any sort of awareness by Melania of Jeffrey Epstein's crime. And I believe if we can go back to that document, something just caught my eye, if we have the opportunity to bring it up, which is the date of when it was sent. This was sent in 2002, exactly, and that's prior to the criminal case even beginning against Jeffrey Epstein, not prior to the abuse that eventually he was charged with here in New York, but it was prior to any sort of investigation becoming public when she sent that note.
Tom and Monica, thank you for giving us insights into a story that I know is going to drive a lot of curiosity and a lot more reporting. Thank you both. And up next, the president of Cuba meets the press Kristen Welker, the reason she's not here in this seat today is she was sitting down with the leader of the island nation in his first ever American TV interview as President Trump threatens to take over Cuba. We'll bring that to you. Stay with us right here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to a Meet the Press exclusive from Havana, as tensions between the U.S. and Cuba are running extremely high. The island nation is facing rolling blackouts and fuel shortages, triggered in large part by an energy blockade imposed by the U.S. And with President Trump taking military action in both Venezuela and Iran, he's also warned that Cuba could be next. Last month, the president suggested that he could, quote, take Cuba if he wanted.
You know, all my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.
Our own Kristen Welker is in Cuba, where she just spoke exclusively with Cuba's president about the future of his country and whether he will remain its leader.
Kelly, in his first television interview ever, Cuban President Díaz-Canel said he thinks it is possible for the United States and Cuba to reach an agreement if the conditions are right. And he was defiant when I pressed him. Would he step down in order to save his country? Would you be willing to step down if it meant saving Cuba? ¿Está dispuesto a dimitir con tal de salvar a Cuba, para la gente de Cuba, al pueblo de Cuba?
Tú que eres una periodista importante y reconocida.
If the United States asked,
journalist, have you ever asked that question to any other president in the world?
Because it's one of the conditions the United States is asking for. Would you ever consider that?
Let me explain. Have you asked that question to any other president in the world?
Have
you asked that question to any other president in the world?
Yes.
Could you ask that question to Trump?
Very hard questions with President Trump.
Eso muestra, ¿es una pregunta tuya o es una pregunta del departamento?
Is that a question from you, or is that coming from the State Department of the U.S. government?
My question is, because it's one of the things that we've heard the U.S. government talk about, that they want political change here in Cuba. So my question for you, if they asked you, if they said this is one condition, would you step down?
Because of your honesty, I'm going to assume that you're asking that question because of those reasons.
Yeah.
In Cuba, the people who are in leadership position is not elected by the U.S. government, and they don't have a mandate from the U.S. government. We have a free sovereign state, a free state. We have self-determination and independence, and we are not subjected to the designs of the United States. On the other hand, Cuban leaders are not here representing an elite of power. You can see my background, where I was born, my family, what I've done throughout my life. We are elected by the people, although there's a narrative trying to disregard that. Any one of us, before we become part of a leadership role, we need to be elected at the grassroots level in an electoral district by thousands of Cubans. And then those who represent the Cubans at the National Assembly of the People's Power elect those leadership positions and those offices like it happens in many other countries around the world. So we have an election system on the basis of people's participation. So whenever we take this responsibility position, and this leadership position is not out of our personal ambition or a corporate ambition or even a party ambition. We do that as a mandate by the people. And the concept of revolutionaries giving up and stepping down is not part of our vocabulary. If the Cuban people understand that I'm not fit for office, that I am not I have no reason to the occasion, then I should not be holding this position of president, I will respond to them. But you need to realize that you should not focus only on the president of the country, because we have a collegiate leadership which is very closely linked to the people. But it's not the United States that can impose anything on us. the U.S. government that has implemented that hostile policy against Cuba has no moral to demand anything from Cuba. They have no moral, not even to say that they are concerned about the situation of the Cuban people and that the Cuban government has taken Cuba to this situation when they have all this responsibility on their shoulders. I think the most important thing would be for them to understand and take this critical position, a sincere position, and that they recognize how much it has cost the Cuban people, what the policy that they have implemented in terms of what they've done, and how much they have deprived the American people from a normal relationship with the Cuban people, and that they set out, as we have requested and as we have asked and as we're interested in, to engage in dialogue and discuss any topic without any condition, not demanding changes from our political system, as we are not demanding changes from the American system, about which we have a number of doubts and a number of considerations, and that we can focus on what brings us together and what can create spaces of understanding in order to move away from confrontation and having a path forward for both countries of benefits of friendship and solidarity.
It is worth noting President Díaz-Canel would not commit to any of the demands that the United States is asking for, raising real questions about whether both sides will be able to reach an agreement. Kelly.
Thank you so much, Kristen. She also pressed the president of Cuba on human rights issues, freedom of the press, and so much more. You can see an extended version of Kristen's exclusive interview this Sunday on Meet the Press, and tonight on NBC Nightly News and on your local NBC station. Now let's turn to some domestic politics. We'll try and squeeze this in on a busy, busy day. Democrats are looking to flip the House and the Senate in November's midterms. We know that. The party will first have to overcome a significant image problem, including from within its own base. In the latest edition of our focus group series, produced by Syracuse University and the research firms Engagis and Sago, we spoke to Democratic voters in Maine and Michigan, two states with key Senate races this November. Here's how those Democratic voters described their own party.
What are the key characteristics or traits that best describe today's Democratic Party?
Subdued.
All right, Paul?
Disjointed.
Cindy?
Lacking.
All right, Lucy?
Spineless.
I think the word that best describes them right now is bruised.
Weak. Diana?
Floundering.
Edward?
Weak but well-intentioned.
Jennifer?
Ineffective and easily distracted.
John?
Spineless.
What do you stand for? Don't define yourself by what you're against or who you're not. What is your platform? What are you going to do? What are the specifics? No platitudes. Get to the brass tacks and get a good ground game.
Despite that negativity, all the voters we spoke to want to see their party, the Democratic Party, win in November. And they all agree that electability is what matters most. Listen to this.
What's more important to you when it comes to voting in the Democratic primary? Picking the candidate that takes the fight to Trump, or picking the one who has the best shot at beating the Republican opponent in November? So, show of fingers. Who says a candidate that will take the fight to Trump? None of you. So, all of you say it's the candidate who has the best shot at beating the Republican opponent in that race. All 7 of you. How many of you say it's the candidate who has the best shot at beating the Republican opponent? All 6. Okay.
The most important thing to me is getting the seat. And if Plattner has a better chance of getting the seat, I like Mills, but Plattner has a better chance of getting the seat. It's about getting the seat.
What gives you confidence that Stevens could beat Mike Rogers?
Because the polls that I've been watching, she came out early, and it seems like, at least in the polls, she's got the best chance of beating him. And again, that is one of my primary factors in who I'm going to vote for. It's someone that can actually win.
Joining me now is Margaret Taleb, director of Syracuse University's Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship Institute. Margaret, it's always great to hear from voters and to know what's on their minds. That's a dose of negativity to the Democratic Party.
Oh, yeah. I mean, these are obviously Maine and Michigan voters are very different. They have different concerns and traits and patterns and things on their mind, but they're all down on their own party and they don't care because they're so down on President Trump's policies with regard to everything, the war in Iran, the price of gas, the execution of ICE unleashing on American citizens, that they're like eyes on the prize. Doesn't matter that we don't like our own party. Doesn't matter that our candidates are complicated and troubled in some cases. We don't even care if they take the fight to Trump. They want to win in November. It is a tactical, strategic choice. And really, these two totally different groups within the Democratic base, whether they're progressives or moderates, whether they're in the Midwest, in a Rust Belt state, or whether they're like on the coast.
I understand there were more progressives in the mix here. Do you think that affects the tone we heard?
Well, actually, we heard some clips for moderates, and they were saying the same things. Again, in Maine in particular, which is a very interesting race because of the dynamics of that Plattner primary with Governor Mills, progressives are more enthusiastic about Plattner than moderates, but it doesn't matter. Even the moderates who aren't enthusiastic think he's the guy, he's the best poised. That's what they're going with, even when they have reservations, which many of them do.
And sometimes in primaries, electability doesn't necessarily produce the best candidate who can ultimately win. We've seen that time and time again. There also seem to be generational issues here. How do you see that playing out?
I think it depends on how you define electability. And what we were hearing in these conversations are themes like youth, like someone who's in their 40s instead of almost 80, was a theme that resonated with some of these voters. And I don't know, how do you define authenticity? But I think in this case, it's the idea that it doesn't matter what you're supposed to say or do. Just go be yourself because that's what Trump does and it's worked for him. It's not to hear them, it's not so much about taking the fight to Trump as it is about playing the game in a way that can be effective. And of course, Trump's not on the ballot in November, but these voters talking strategically about the idea that the only way to blunt the president's policies is to blunt his party's ability to control the chambers of Congress. And so that's really what they were talking about.
And do you get a sense these voters sense their sort of outsized power when you look at the map? Everyone gets one vote, it's counted the same, but because of where they live, their ultimate choices could shift that party control.
Yeah, it's funny. Most voters, especially the, sort of everyday voters, are not thinking about who's going to flip the Senate. Can we be the ones who flip the Senate? The Senate is never the races everyone's talking about. They're talking about the Senate.
That tells us something, doesn't it? And when it comes to quality candidates versus electability, are you seeing or hearing anything there that do you think voters are picking it in a way that ultimately gives us kind of the quality candidates that tend to do better?
We heard some of these nuances in both races. In Michigan, people saying they liked a candidate because they thought they were very qualified, but then at the same time, winning is the most important thing. So I think these voters are trying to sort it out in real time, juggle foreign policy, economics, kitchen table, and Trump all in one.
So much more to talk about. Yeah. Glad to see you and appreciate you bringing these conversations to us. Margaret, thank you so much. And we're back tomorrow with more of Meet the Press Now. And of course, there's more news straight ahead right here on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.